Flight Atlantic Airways 524 was preparing for departure from Los Angeles to Miami. Inside the plane, passengers bustled as they settled into their seats. Amidst the crowd was a young girl named Lila, barely 8 years old, with soft brown curls framing her face and large, wondering eyes that seemed too keen for her age. Holding onto her hand was a man in his late 40s, her father, who wore a cold, reserved expression, distant even as he held her. His intense, almost detached demeanor created a strange contrast to her innocent curiosity. Edna, the lead flight attendant on this evening flight, was positioned near the front of the plane, observing each passenger who boarded. With over a decade in her role, Edna had met countless faces, each with their own story. Yet she felt an inexplicable unease as her gaze fell upon Lila and her father. The girl's face was a mix of emotions too complex for a child her age: fear, uncertainty, and a strange, silent plea that Edna couldn't shake. As the girl passed her by, a wave of instinct surged through Edna, an intuition that something was amiss. She couldn't quite pinpoint why, but the father's cold grip on the girl's tiny hand and his tight-lipped expression only deepened her concern. Taking a deep breath, Edna greeted them warmly as they approached. "Good evening," she said with her usual smile, attempting to catch Lila's eye. The girl glanced up, her expression softening for a moment as if reassured by Edna's presence. But just as she seemed to draw a breath to speak, her father's stern voice broke the brief connection. "We're fine," he said firmly, his hand tightening around Lila's. He offered Edna a curt nod, barely looking at her, and led the girl to their seats. As the passengers settled in, Edna continued her routine preparations. But her thoughts kept returning to row 15, where the girl and her father had seated themselves. She glanced over occasionally, catching glimpses of Lila looking around anxiously, her hands fidgeting, her small shoulders tense. Each time Edna approached, Lila's gaze would flicker over to her, as if yearning for a connection, for help. The unease grew stronger. The child seemed more than just restless or bored. She seemed scared. And her father? He was almost completely disengaged, absorbed in his phone, not once sparing his daughter even a glance. A little while into the flight, Edna decided she needed to act. She passed by row 15 with a tray of beverages, taking her time to look at the young girl closely. As she stopped by their row, she noticed Lila was staring down at her lap, her fingers clenched tightly together. "Would you like something to drink, sweetheart?" Edna asked gently, leaning slightly toward her. Lila looked up, her eyes wide, and for the first time, Edna saw the unmistakable sheen of tears. Before Lila could speak, her father looked up from his phone with a cold, calculating gaze. "She doesn't need anything," he said shortly, dismissing Edna's question as he pulled Lila closer to him. The little girl shrank back into her seat, but her eyes remained locked with Edna's, silently pleading. In that fleeting moment, Edna felt the weight of an unspoken cry for help. Returning to the galley, Edna's mind raced. She had seen enough odd behavior in her years as a flight attendant to know when something was wrong, and everything about this situation felt deeply unsettling. She decided to confide in David, her closest colleague and a fellow flight attendant on the flight. Catching him by the storage area, she quickly recounted her observations, describing the tension between the father and daughter, the girl's apparent distress, and the father's unsettling coldness. David listened intently, nodding with a pensive look. "It sounds strange, Edna," he said, glancing over his shoulder toward the cabin. "But let's not jump to conclusions too quickly. Maybe she's just nervous about flying, or maybe she had an argument with her father before they boarded." David's words were cautious, but Edna could see he was affected by her account. "Still, let's keep an eye on them," he added. "If something's truly wrong, we'll notice more signs." Edna agreed, but as she returned to the cabin, she couldn't shake the sense of urgency that prickled at the back of her mind. Watching discreetly, she saw Lila's small face peeking out from her seat, her gaze darting around the cabin. The girl's face seemed paler now, her lips pressed tightly together, her fingers clenching and unclenching on her lap. Every time she made a small movement, her father would glance sharply at her, as if to warn her into submission. The rigid dynamics between them unsettled Edna, but she knew she had to be cautious in her approach. As the plane settled into cruising altitude, Edna returned to row 15, this time with a new strategy. Carrying a tray with a single glass of orange juice, she approached with a soft smile. "I brought you a little something," she murmured, setting the juice in front of Lila. The girl hesitated, glancing up at her father, whose attention had drifted back to his phone. Seizing the brief moment of privacy, Lila looked directly at Edna, and in a barely audible whisper, her words spilled out. "Please, help me." Edna felt a chill run down her spine as she registered the quiet desperation in the girl's voice. Lila's eyes, now glistening with tears, searched Edna's face for any sign of hope, any indication that her silent call had been heard. In that instant, Edna knew her instincts had been right. Something was terribly wrong. As Edna returned to the galley, her heart was racing. Lila's whispered plea for help echoed in her mind, each word laden with a quiet desperation. "Please, help me." The simplicity of the words carried a weight that left Edna feeling unsettled. Years of experience had taught her to trust her instincts, and today, every fiber of her being told her something was terribly wrong. But as she moved around in the small galley space, she knew she needed a plan. She couldn't just act on impulse, not when a child's safety was at stake. David, noticing Edna's troubled expression, leaned closer. "What did she say?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Edna took a deep breath, her eyes reflecting both determination and worry. "David, she's scared. She said she doesn't want to be here. She said he took her and told her she'd never see her mom again." The gravity of Edna's words sank in slowly, each one pulling David's face into a deeper frown. David's gaze flickered toward row 15, where the man sat beside Lila, his attention now back on his phone, seemingly oblivious to the turmoil brewing around him. "That's serious," he whispered back, glancing back at Edna. "But we need to be careful. If we act too quickly, he might catch on, and things could escalate." Edna nodded, fully aware of the risks. She knew that even a slight misstep could jeopardize Lila's safety, but she was resolute. There was a child in need, and she had a responsibility, not just as a flight attendant, but as a human being, to protect her. "What if we can find a way to distract him?" Edna suggested. "If we can get him focused on something else, even just for a moment, I could try to talk to her again, maybe get more details." David nodded thoughtfully, his mind racing as he considered their options. "I could go over and offer him a drink, try to engage him in conversation. It might buy you a few minutes to get closer to Lila without drawing his attention." They quickly agreed on the plan. David moved first, strolling casually toward row 15 with a professional yet friendly demeanor. He leaned down slightly toward the man, offering a polite smile. "Sir, would you like a complimentary drink?" David's tone was light and easygoing, expertly masking the tension simmering beneath the surface. The man looked up, his expression initially one of annoyance, but David's calm, respectful manner seemed to disarm him slightly. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded curtly. "Sure," he muttered, setting his phone down reluctantly. David seized the opportunity, handing him the drink with a casual comment about the flight's smooth trajectory and the expected arrival time. Engaging the man in small talk, he continued asking about his travel plans and any preferences for accommodations. The man seemed to relax a bit under David's polite attention, his focus now diverted from Lila. Watching from the galley, Edna took a deep breath and moved toward Lila's seat, trying to keep her steps calm and unhurried. As she reached row 15, she knelt beside Lila's seat, her voice soft and reassuring. "Hi, Lila," she whispered, glancing at the man to ensure he was still engaged with David. "Can you tell me more about what's going on?" Lila looked up at Edna, her large, fearful eyes conveying a mix of relief and dread. She hesitated, glancing nervously at her father, who was now distracted by David's conversation. Taking a shaky breath, she leaned closer to Edna, her voice barely audible. I don't want to go with him," she murmured, her words laced with a quiet desperation. "He took me from my mom. He said I'll never see her again." Edna felt a pang of empathy surge through her, mixed with a mounting sense of urgency. Lila's small hand trembled as she gripped the edge of her seat, her tiny fingers white from the pressure. Edna gently placed her hand over Lila's, a subtle gesture meant to offer reassurance. "Listen, Lila," she whispered, maintaining eye contact. "I'm here, and I'm going to help you. You're not alone." Lila's eyes filled with tears, but she managed a slight nod, her grip on Edna's hand tightening. However, their brief moment of connection was cut short when the man's gaze flickered toward them, his expression darkening as he noticed Edna's proximity to his daughter. His eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering across his face. Straightening up, Edna gave him a practiced smile, masking the unease brewing inside her. "Just checking to make sure everyone's comfortable," she said brightly, carefully modulating her tone. She couldn't afford to raise his suspicions any further. The man's expression softened slightly, though his gaze lingered on her, clearly cautious of her interactions with Lila. Returning to the galley, Edna's mind raced. She had confirmation now. Lila was in genuine distress, and her fears weren't merely the nervous jitters of a young child on a plane. This was something far darker, something that required immediate attention. But as she glanced toward the cockpit, she knew she couldn't simply confront the man outright. Not only would it risk Lila's safety, but any sudden action could create a dangerous situation for everyone on board. David joined her a few moments later, his expression grave. "So, what did she say?" he asked, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. Edna took a steadying breath, her voice a whisper. "David, it's worse than I thought. She said he took her from her mother. She's terrified, David. She thinks she'll never see her mom again." Her words hung heavy in the air, the weight of the situation settling over them both. David's face tightened, a determined look flashing in his eyes. "We need to inform the pilot," he said quietly. "They can alert the authorities on the ground so they're ready when we land. But we have to be careful. If he catches wind of our plan, he might do something drastic." They both knew that time was of the essence. Edna nodded, her mind already calculating the next steps. She knew she needed to keep a close eye on Lila while maintaining a sense of normalcy for the other passengers. As they prepared to execute their plan, Edna felt a surge of resolve. Lila's safety was now her top priority, and she would do whatever it took to ensure the little girl was protected. After briefing the pilot, who assured them that authorities would be alerted, Edna resumed her duties, all the while keeping a discreet watch on row 15. She made a point of passing by every so often, catching Lila's eye whenever she could, offering the child a silent promise that she wasn't alone. Lila, for her part, seemed to draw strength from these brief moments, her posture slightly more relaxed with each glance Edna threw her way. But as the hours passed, Edna's anxiety grew. The man remained mostly glued to his phone, his expression calm but distant, his focus solely on whatever was occupying his screen. Every so often, however, he would cast a scrutinizing glance toward Lila, as if silently reinforcing his control over her. And each time he did, Lila's shoulders would tense, her gaze dropping back to her lap as she withdrew further into herself. Edna knew they needed to act before the situation escalated. She signaled to David, and together they approached the pilot once more, discussing the details of the landing. The plan was set. As soon as the plane touched down, authorities would be ready to intervene, ensuring that Lila would be safe. But until then, Edna and David would have to maintain the delicate balance, all the while hoping that their efforts would be enough. With everything in place, Edna felt a small sense of relief. though it was overshadowed by the gravity of what lay ahead. She glanced once more at Lila, who looked back at her with eyes filled with both fear and a fragile hope. In that moment, Edna knew that no matter the risk, she was prepared to do whatever it took to keep that promise. As the plane cruised at 35,000 feet, Edna felt every minute stretch into eternity. She kept a vigilant eye on row 15, her heart sinking each time she saw Lila's small frame tense under her father's cold, indifferent gaze. The quiet anxiety that had simmered since takeoff was now a palpable weight pressing down on her. Every time Edna caught Lila's eye, she offered a gentle, reassuring smile, silently promising that she wasn't alone. But with each passing minute, Edna's urgency grew. The thought of leaving this child's fate to chance was unbearable. Just then, turbulence rattled the plane. Lila's eyes widened in fear as she gripped her seat, glancing nervously at her father, who remained focused on his phone. Edna, standing nearby, steadied herself and made a show of walking calmly through the aisle, projecting an air of confidence to reassure the passengers. When she reached row 15, she knelt beside Lila, her voice calm. "It's all right, sweetheart. We're just passing through some bumps, nothing to worry about," she said gently. Lila nodded, her small face relaxing for a moment as Edna's presence seemed to calm her. But as soon as Edna moved to stand up, the man's cold gaze landed on her, a dark glint in his eyes. Edna felt a chill, sensing the silent warning he was attempting to convey. She forced herself to remain composed, offering him a polite smile before moving back toward the galley. David was waiting for her, concern etched into his face. "Everything okay?" he asked, glancing briefly over her shoulder toward row 15. Edna sighed, glancing around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "I'm not sure. I keep catching him looking at her with... I don't know, David. It's hard to explain. But whatever this is, it's not just a misunderstanding." David nodded, his jaw clenched. "Well, the authorities are set to meet us when we land. All we have to do now is keep things calm until then." He hesitated, his eyes flickering with worry. "But I think we should have a backup plan, in case something happens before we touch down." Edna nodded, sensing the urgency of his words. Together, they decided to keep a close watch on row 15, taking turns to make rounds while keeping the other passengers comfortable and unaware of the tense situation unfolding. They both knew that the last thing they wanted was for the father to sense their suspicions and attempt something drastic. A few minutes later, Edna passed by Lila's row once again, this time under the guise of offering snacks. She noticed the man had fallen asleep, his head leaned back against the seat, his phone still loosely clutched in his hand. Seeing an opportunity, she leaned down to Lila, whispering softly, "We're almost there, honey. Just a little longer, okay?" Lila nodded, her small fingers gripping Edna's hand tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the plane. "I don't know what would have happened if you didn't come." Edna's heart ached as she squeezed Lila's hand. "You're safe now, I promise. Just stay close to me when we land." Suddenly, the man stirred, and Edna pulled back, forcing a calm expression onto her face as his eyes snapped open. He glanced suspiciously between Edna and Lila, his expression hardening. Edna gave him a polite nod, offering him a packet of snacks. "Would you like something to eat?" she asked, her tone smooth and professional. He shook his head curtly, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Lila. She shrank back in her seat, her gaze dropping to her lap. Edna felt a surge of anger, but she knew she had to remain composed. With a final nod, she turned and walked back to the galley, her mind racing. The minutes ticked by painfully slow as the plane began its gradual descent. Edna felt a mix of relief and tension as the announcement was made over the intercom, signaling the start of the landing process. She caught David's eye from across the cabin, both of them sharing a look of anticipation. They were close now, but she knew that the most critical moments were still ahead. As the plane's wheels touched down with a slight bump, Edna felt a rush of relief, But as she glanced toward row 15, she noticed that the man was watching her intently, his gaze sharp and assessing. Her pulse quickened, realizing that he might have sensed something was amiss. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, thanking the passengers for their patience and announcing that they would begin deplaning shortly. Edna exchanged a quick glance with David, both of them preparing to put their plan into action. They had decided that David would assist with the disembarkation, keeping an eye on the father while Edna stayed close to Lila, ready to guide her to the authorities. As the line of passengers began to move, Edna saw the man stand, his grip tight around Lila's hand. She could see the tension in his stance, a dark look shadowing his face as he pulled her close. With each step they took toward the exit, Edna's heart pounded harder. They were so close now, just a few more steps. But as they neared the door, the man suddenly hesitated, his gaze darting around the cabin. He seemed to sense something was wrong, his grip tightening on Lila's hand until she winced in pain. Edna quickly stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Sir, let me help your daughter step down. It's safer and easier for everyone that way." The man's eyes narrowed, but the urgency in Edna's tone and the flow of passengers around them seemed to leave him little choice. Reluctantly, he released Lila's hand, allowing Edna to guide her forward. As they stepped out of the cabin, Edna spotted a group of plainclothes officers waiting near the exit, their eyes scanning the crowd. Edna led Lila toward them, feeling a wave of relief wash over her as she saw the officers reach out for the girl, quickly surrounding her in a protective shield. She glanced back, seeing David discreetly step in front of the man, engaging him in polite conversation to buy them a few precious seconds. Just as Edna passed Lila to the officers, the man's voice cut through the noise, sharp and filled with fury. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice rising as he tried to push past David. His eyes locked onto Lila, and in that instant, Edna saw a flash of raw anger and desperation. The officers moved swiftly, blocking his path as one of them stepped forward, calmly explaining that they had questions regarding his travel with the girl. But the man's face twisted in rage, and he lunged forward, his hand outstretched toward Lila. Edna instinctively stepped between them, her body a protective barrier, her gaze fierce. "Sir, please calm down," one of the officers said, their voice steady but firm. The man ignored them, his face a mask of fury as he struggled against their hold. In a matter of moments, the officers restrained him, his protests echoing through the terminal as they led him away. Edna felt a tremor of relief as the tension finally broke, the threat dissolving before her eyes. She turned to Lila, who was clutching one of the officer's hands, her face a mixture of fear and relief. Edna knelt down beside her, her voice gentle. "You're safe now, Lila. They'll take care of you." Lila looked at her with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. She threw her arms around Edna, holding on tightly. Edna hugged her back, feeling a surge of warmth and pride. She knew they had done everything they could, and it had been enough. As Edna stood back, watching the officers lead Lila toward the waiting area where a social worker awaited her, she felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The events of the flight replayed in her mind, each moment now etched into her memory. She knew this day would stay with her, a reminder of the quiet power of compassion and the profound responsibility she carried in her role. As the crowd around the terminal began to thin out, Edna found herself lingering near the area where Lila was being attended to by a social worker and a few plainclothes officers. The chaos and tension from moments earlier were slowly dissipating, replaced by a quiet sense of relief. Edna watched as Lila clutched tightly to the social worker's hand, her small face pale, but filled with a sense of hope. One of the officers who had been involved in restraining Lila's father approached Edna, nodding in acknowledgement. "Thank you for everything you did back there," he said, his voice steady but warm. "Your quick thinking and careful handling of the situation made all the difference. Without you, this could have ended very differently." Edna nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle over her. "I couldn't ignore it," she replied softly, her eyes drifting back to Lila. Something in her eyes. She just seemed so lost. I couldn't walk away. The officer gave her a reassuring smile. You didn't just protect her today. You gave her a chance at safety and freedom. That's not something everyone would have been able to do. As he walked away, Edna's gaze returned to Lila, who was now looking in her direction. Their eyes met, and Edna felt a surge of emotion, a connection born from shared moments of fear, courage, and resilience. She took a deep breath, then walked over, her steps slow and purposeful. Lila's face lit up as she saw Edna approaching, and she let go of the social worker's hand, rushing toward her. Edna knelt down to meet her, opening her arms as Lila wrapped herself around her neck, clinging tightly. "Thank you," Lila whispered, her voice muffled against Edna's shoulder. "I was so scared." Edna held her close, feeling the weight of everything the little girl had endured. "You were so brave, Lila," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "You trusted me, and you held on. That takes a lot of courage." They stayed like that for a few moments, wrapped in a quiet embrace. When Lila finally pulled back, her eyes were glistening, but she managed a small, tentative smile. Will I see my mom again?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Edna nodded, placing a gentle hand on Lila's shoulder. "Yes, sweetheart. The social workers and the officers are going to help you find her. You're safe now, and they'll make sure you're reunited with your mom." Lila's face softened, and she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm glad you were there. I don't know what would have happened if you didn't see me." Edna felt a pang of pride and a sense of purpose. She knew that her role as a flight attendant went beyond just ensuring safety on flights. It was about truly seeing the people around her, especially those who might need help but can't always ask for it directly. The social worker approached them, gently placing a hand on Lila's shoulder. "Lila, we're going to take you somewhere safe for now, okay? And soon, we'll make sure you're back with your mom." Lila looked up at Edna, as if seeking one last reassurance. Edna squeezed her hand gently, her eyes filled with warmth. "Remember what I said. You were so brave. No matter what happens, don't ever forget that." With a final, lingering look, Lila let go of Edna's hand, allowing the social worker to lead her away. As she walked toward the exit, Lila turned back one last time, her small face breaking into a grateful smile. It was a smile that spoke of hope, resilience, and the beginning of a new chapter. Edna watched until she could no longer see Lila, the quiet ache in her heart tempered by the knowledge that the little girl was finally safe. She took a deep breath, letting the gravity of the day settle over her. The terminal felt different now, as if the air itself was lighter. Just as she was about to leave, another officer approached her, clipboard in hand. "Miss Edna," he said, extending his hand, "we'd like to get a formal statement from you regarding the events on the flight. It'll help us with our investigation and ensure Lila's safety moving forward." Edna nodded, her expression resolute. She was more than willing to do whatever it took to ensure Lila's future was protected. As she followed the officer to a quiet area where they could go over her statement, she found herself reflecting on the day's events. The chance encounter with a frightened child, the quiet determination that had guided her actions, and the bond she had formed with Lila in those fleeting moments. Once she had given her statement, the officer thanked her, his gratitude evident. "You made a real difference today. People like you remind us why it's worth fighting to protect those who can't protect themselves." Edna smiled, a soft but determined look in her eyes. "I just did what anyone would do," she replied humbly. But deep down, she knew that the connection she had felt with Lila was rare, a powerful reminder of the impact one person's compassion could have on another's life. As Edna made her way toward the exit, she felt a sense of peace. She knew that while her job involved countless responsibilities, it also offered opportunities to change lives in ways she hadn't fully appreciated until now. And as she stepped out into the crisp evening air, she looked up at the sky, a small smile playing on her lips. somewhere out there, Lila was safe. And that, for Edna, was more than enough. As Edna stepped out of the airport, she took a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. The sky was beginning to darken, and the cool evening air brushed against her face, carrying with it a sense of calm and closure. Today had been a day unlike any other, a day where her role as a flight attendant had shifted into something far more profound. She knew she'd carry the memory of Lila's small, hopeful face with her for the rest of her life, a constant reminder of the power of human connection and compassion. A week later, Edna received a handwritten note in her mailbox. Opening it, she recognized the familiar handwriting of Lila, its innocent scrawl bringing a smile to her face. "Dear Edna, thank you for helping me. I'm with my mom again now, and I'm happy. You're my hero. Love, Lila." Edna felt a warmth spread through her as she read Lila's words. The child's simple message confirmed that every decision she'd made that day had been worth it. Lila was safe, surrounded by people who loved her. Edna knew that although her role in Lila's life had been brief, it had made a lasting impact on both of them. With a final smile, she folded the note carefully, placing it in her bag. She returned to her flights, carrying with her a renewed sense of purpose and the knowledge that she had changed a life, if only for a moment. And, with that experience, she was reminded that even the smallest acts of kindness could make all the difference in someone else's world. If you found this story as inspiring and touching as I did, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel, Inspiring Hearts, for more heartwarming stories. Hit the bell icon to receive notifications whenever we share new stories of hope, resilience, and the impact of kindness. And if you enjoyed Lila's journey, share it with others. Let's spread the message of courage and compassion. Together, we can continue discovering and celebrating more powerful stories.